Philippians 4:13 is one of the most quoted Bible verses on the planet. It's been on Tim Tebow's face. It's on millions of t-shirts, gym walls, phone cases, coffee mugs, and graduation cards. Athletes recite it before games. Motivational speakers build entire talks around it. Christians tape it to their bathroom mirrors. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And almost everyone who quotes it is using it to mean the same thing. With God's help, I can achieve anything I set my mind to. I can win. I can conquer. I can break through every obstacle. Nothing is impossible for the person who has Christ on their side. That is a beautiful idea. It is also almost certainly not what Paul meant when he wrote it. Here is the detail that changes everything. Paul wrote those words in a Roman prison cell, not on a beach, not after a victory, not during a season of abundance or clarity or momentum. In a cell, chained to a guard, awaiting trial, with death listed as one of the more realistic outcomes. The cell was dark. It was rat-infested. It smelled like everything a first-century Roman prison would smell like, and its primary function was holding people who were about to be executed. That is the setting of the most quoted motivational verse in Christian history. And when you understand the setting, the verse doesn't become less powerful. It becomes something far more powerful than anything you could put on a gym wall. Because Paul wasn't describing the strength to win, he was describing something much harder and much more useful. He was describing the strength to stay sane, stay faithful, and stay at peace, in the worst circumstances a human being can experience. That is the verse. That is what it actually means. And by the end of this video, you will never read it the same way again. Before we get into the verse itself, you need to understand who Paul was when he wrote it, because most people read Philippians as if Paul was a man who had simply had a hard life in general. What he actually experienced is in a different category. In 2 Corinthians 11, written before his Roman imprisonment, Paul lists what his ministry had cost him up to that point. 5 times he received 39 lashes from Jewish authorities. 39 lashes was the maximum allowed by law. 40 was considered potentially lethal. So they stopped at 39. Paul received that beating 5 separate times. 3 times he was beaten with rods by Roman authorities. Once he was stoned and left for dead. 3 times his ship sank. He spent a day and a night adrift in open ocean. He went without sleep, without food, without adequate clothing. He experienced danger from bandits, from rivers, from crowds, from people who claimed to be on his side. And that list was written before his final imprisonment, before the chains, before the Roman cell. By the time Paul wrote Philippians, the letter that contains verse 13, he had already lived through more physical suffering than most people in history. He knew, from the inside, what it felt like to be hungry, to be cold, to be beaten within an inch of his life, to float in the ocean with no rescue in sight, to wonder if this was going to be the moment it ended. That is the man writing the verse. Not a motivational speaker standing on a stage in comfortable shoes. A man who had been shipwrecked 3 times, who knew exactly what it felt like to have nothing, who was currently chained to a guard and awaiting a trial that might result in his execution. When that man writes, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me," he is not describing the strength to accomplish a personal goal. He is describing something that had been forged in him over decades of surviving the unsurvivable. And you need to know what that something is before you can understand why the verse matters as much as it does. Go back 2 verses. Philippians 4:11. Not that I speak from want, for I have learned, in whatever state I am, to be content. One word in that sentence carries more weight than any other. Learned. Not I was given contentment. Not I was born with contentment. Not God dropped contentment on me in a moment of revelation. Learned, past tense, active, earned through a process. That word implies everything you'd expect it to imply. If Paul learned contentment, There was a time when he didn't have it. There were moments, probably many of them, when he was not content. When the circumstances were too heavy, when the suffering went too long, when the disappointment was too sharp. He wasn't born into this. He was trained into it. By life, by repeated exposure to circumstances that should have broken him, by choosing, over and over again, not to let what was happening on the outside determine what was happening on the inside. Now go to verse 12. This is where the Greek becomes important. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. The phrase, learned the secret, is one word in Greek, muo. Muo was a technical term in Paul's world. It was the word used for being initiated into one of the Greek mystery religions, secret religious societies, that had layers of hidden knowledge available only to those who had been fully initiated. To be muoed was to be let into something that outsiders did not have access to. It was not knowledge you could read about. It was not something you could be handed. You were initiated into it through the experience of the rites themselves. Paul borrowed that word deliberately. He was saying, I have been initiated into this. Not taught it theoretically, not handed it as a gift, initiated. Through the actual experience of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need repeatedly, over years, until the secret was no longer a secret to me because I had lived my way into it. The word muo appears only once in the entire New Testament. Here, in this passage, Paul chose it with precision, and what he was communicating is this: contentment is not a personality trait. It is not a spiritual gift. It is a skill acquired through initiation, through lived experience, through the repeated practice of trusting God in circumstances that do not cooperate with your preferences. That is the secret of verse 12. And verse 13 is the climax of that secret. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. The all things is not everything you can imagine achieving. The all things is every circumstance listed in verses 11 and 12, hungry and well-fed, in plenty and in want, abased and abounding. Paul is not saying, I can accomplish any goal with Christ's help. He is saying, I can face any circumstance, including the worst ones, and remain intact, because Christ is the source of my stability, not my circumstances. That is not a smaller statement than the motivational version. It is a dramatically larger one. The motivational version of Philippians 4:13 feels powerful. But here is what it costs you. If I can do all things through Christ means I can achieve any goal with God's help, then what happens when you don't achieve the goal? What happens when you failed, despite praying and believing and claiming the verse? The unspoken implication is devastating. Either your faith wasn't strong enough, or God didn't show up for you, or the promise isn't actually true. The motivational version of this verse sets you up for a specific kind of spiritual crisis, the kind that happens when the verse doesn't work, when the business fails, when the healing doesn't come, when the dream doesn't arrive on the schedule you expected, and you had Philippians 4:13 written on your wall the whole time. Paul never promised that believers would win every competition, succeed at every endeavor, or be spared from losing. He didn't live that life. He lost constantly by the world's standard of winning. His shipwrecks were not victories. His beatings were not metaphors. His imprisonment was not a stepping stone to a better outcome. There is significant historical evidence that he was eventually executed by Rome. But none of that made the verse less true for him, because the verse was never about winning. It was about surviving anything without losing yourself. There is a Roman prison, a man chained to a guard, the smell of a cell, and Paul, writing not despite those circumstances, but from inside them, that he has found the stability to hold together in any condition life can produce. That is the power of the verse. Not motivational power, survival power. The kind that matters on the actual worst days of your life, not the days when you're gearing up for something exciting. Now we need to address the second half of the verse. through Christ who strengthens me. That phrase is also routinely misread. It's usually interpreted as, Christ gives me supernatural ability to accomplish difficult things. Like a power-up, like a spiritual energy source you plug into and suddenly you can do more than you could before. But look at what Paul says the strength actually produces in context. It doesn't produce victories. It produces contentment. It produces the ability to be abased, that's the word. To be brought low, to be humiliated, to be reduced and remain intact. Christ's strengthening in Paul's framework is not capacity enhancement. It is internal stabilization. It is the presence of God functioning as the fixed point around which everything else in Paul can rotate without collapsing. His circumstances were not stable. His health was not stable. His financial situation was not stable. His physical safety was certainly not stable. What was stable was the presence of Christ, and from that one stable thing, he could face everything else. In Philippians 4:6-7, just a few verses before our passage, Paul writes, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." The peace that surpasses understanding. Not the circumstances that surpass difficulty. The peace, and it guards, that's a military word in Greek. A garrison protecting a city, it guards your heart and mind in the middle of circumstances that have not been resolved. That is the strength Paul was talking about. Not the strength to change the circumstances, the strength to be guarded by peace while inside them. He was in prison, chained to a guard, possibly facing execution, and he wrote a letter describing peace. Not because the circumstances were good, because the presence of Christ was stable in a way his circumstances could not disrupt. Here is the practical question that comes out of everything we've discussed. Which version of this verse do you actually need in your life right now? If your life is going well, if you're building towards something, if there's momentum, if the door is open, then yes, the motivational reading is not entirely useless. Confidence is not a sin. Believing that God can help you accomplish difficult things is not wrong theology. But if your life is in a season that doesn't look like winning, if you're in a season of loss, or waiting, or suffering, or a situation that is not resolving on your preferred timeline, then you need the actual Philippians 4:13, the one Paul wrote. Because the promise Paul was actually making is the one you need most when circumstances are hardest. The promise is not, God will help you achieve your goals. The promise is, you can remain intact, at peace, stable, functional, even joyful in any circumstance life produces, because the source of your stability is not your circumstances. It is Christ. And Christ is not circumstantial. That means the verse is not less useful than you thought. It is useful in a completely different way, and in the way that matters most. Not when you're trying to motivate yourself towards something better, when you're stuck in something you cannot change. When you are in the Roman prison, not the race. When the circumstance has not moved and you need to know whether you can hold together inside it. Paul's answer, from inside a Roman prison cell, is yes, you can. Not because you are strong enough, because the Christ who is present with you in the prison is stable in a way the prison cannot touch. I want to be careful about one thing before I close. Correcting the popular reading of this verse does not mean taking away hope. It does not mean God never brings breakthroughs, never heals, never changes circumstances. The same Paul who wrote Philippians 4:13 also wrote that God is able to do far more abundantly than all we ask or think. The same Jesus who was crucified rose from the dead. Circumstances do change. Doors do open. Healing does come. What the corrected reading does is remove the false assumption that faith always produces favorable outcomes on your timeline. and it replaces that assumption with something sturdier. The promise that whatever the outcome, whatever the timeline, whatever the circumstance, you have access to a peace and a stability that does not depend on any of those variables. That is not a smaller promise. It is a more honest and more durable one. The motivational version of Philippians 4:13 is useful on the days things are going well. The actual version is useful on every other day. Paul wrote this letter to thank a church that had sent him money while he was in prison. He was chained to a guard. Death was a real possibility. Competing preachers were using his imprisonment as an opportunity to undermine his credibility. His provisions were described as meager, and his letter, written from that situation, uses the word rejoice or joy 14 times in 4 chapters. It is one of the most joyful documents in the entire New Testament, not because anything in his circumstances warranted it, because Paul had been initiated muored into something that his circumstances could not touch. He had learned the secret. Through 5 beatings and 3 shipwrecks, and a night and a day floating in the sea, and years of imprisonment, the secret was not optimism. It was not denial. It was the discovery, tested in real conditions, that the presence of Christ is stable when everything else is not. And from that stable place, he could write, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." Not all achievements, all things, every circumstance, every season, every outcome, every prison, every loss, every version of life that does not look like what you planned. You can remain intact through all of it, not because you are strong enough, because the one who is with you in it is. That is the verse, and it is far more useful than the coffee mug version, because the coffee mug version only helps you when things are already going well. The real version is for every other day.